Jim and Aiden were both born in the month of September, just 2 weeks apart, in the year 1923. Their families were near neighbors in Pokeweed Holler, that is if you could call living 2 miles away a near neighbor. The boys grew up as close as brothers. In their early years they played together, later they worked and hunted together, and when they turned 18, they joined the army together. Their childhood had been a fairly idyllic one and their young adulthood uneventful. Only one problem: by the time they celebrated their 18th birthday, they'd both fallen crazy in love with the same girl, Hannah Hinton. If you had drawn a triangle on a map with one corner marking where each of the boys lived, down in the holler and the third corner a ways up the mountain to Turner's Ridge, that's where Hannah lived with her grandmother, an old granny woman that tended to anyone needing her help. Both Hannah's parents had died of the influenza that swept through the Ozarks back when she was just a baby. Hannah had long chestnut hair that she wore in a ponytail that swished from side to side as she hop-skipped down the steep mountain paths, following along behind her granny, and moss-green eyes that seemed to sparkle and glisten when she was happy, which was most all the time. A year younger than the boys, she never seemed to favor one over the other. The three grew up together, did everything together, went everywhere together. When they played house, Jim and Aiden had to take turns, one being the daddy, the other a son. Same thing when they played Tarzan of the Apes. Hannah was always Jane, of course, with one of the boys playing Tarzan and the other Cheetah one day. Their roles would switch the next. They even sat three on a mule which they rode to the little one-room schoolhouse. Once when they went to a picture show in Little Rock, Hannah sat between the two boys and held each boy's hand. If other boys were interested in Hannah, it didn't do them a whit of good because her boys, as Hannah called them, made it clear there was no more room in the relationship. Things rolled happily along until Jim turned 18. His granny, up in Mountain Home, lived all alone and had taken seriously ill. Jim's father worked at the sawmill and couldn't leave, so it was Jim that took his mother to care for her mother through her sickness. They were gone almost a month before the grandmother recovered. Somehow, while Jim was gone, Aiden had made some headway with Hannah, and that's when the trouble began. Well, it wasn't trouble really, more of an uneasy alliance. Somehow, things were a little strained, not quite what they had been. Jim noticed that Hannah leaned into Aiden's shoulder now when she laughed at something he said, and sometimes she'd reach for his hand when they walked. Jim wasn't left out exactly, but he knew she'd finally made her choice, and it saddened him. Jim and Aiden had both finished high school the year before, quite an accomplishment back in those days, back in that part of the country. But they had only been able to find intermittent, part-time work. Steady employment of any kind was practically unheard of in the Ozarks back in the 20s. Sawmill work being about the only industry offering anything reliable. Hannah would be graduating soon, and Jim knew he didn't want to be around for what was sure to come next. Actually, he was a little surprised that Aiden hadn't yet asked Hannah to marry him. Jim decided he would make it easier on all concerned by announcing that he had decided to go into the army. Much to his surprise, Aiden said he was going too. There was a war going on. Germany had invaded Poland, then Great Britain and France, and now America had joined in the fight against the Nazi communists that wanted to dominate the world and come to America and change the American way of life. That was the extent of the boys' understanding of the war. That was what they'd heard anyway, and President Roosevelt needed every able man to help turn the tide against Hitler and his evil plan. And now, both Jim and Aiden were bound to do their duty by their country. On the day they departed, Hannah came along with both the boys' parents to the train station. When she kissed Jim goodbye, it was a kiss on the cheek. Aiden's kiss was full on the mouth and lasted somewhat longer. Promises to write flew back and forth between the open windows of the train and the station platform, and for the first time in their lives, the three were parted. Luckily, the two boys, as well as several of their friends from the Ozarks, managed to stay together all the way through basic training in Camp Forest, Tennessee, and even after being shipped over to England, where they immediately were thrust into battle. But fighting or not, when in camp, each man was expected to pull his duty there as well. Jim became the postal officer for his unit, a volunteer position that kept him from KP duty, which Aiden had not been so lucky to avoid. They each endured all the hardships and deprivations suffered by every other soldier fighting for his country and so far away from home, but at least they were together. When the letters from Hannah, the only one left behind that knew how to write, began to arrive, the letters passed through Jim's hands before they reached Aiden. It was the luck of his position that spawned the idea to waylay Hannah's letters to Aiden, allowing it to seem that he, Jim, was receiving them more often. The ruse grew to Jim failing to post Aiden's letters to Hannah. It began as a simple deception, he convinced himself, in hopes of shifting her allegiance to him, just as it had shifted to Aiden when Jim had been forced to leave for the extended visit to his grandmother's a few months before. As the days and then weeks wore on, the letters between Hannah and Aiden were fewer and soon ceased altogether. As the months passed, Jim regaled Hannah with stories of his and Aiden's visits to nearby villages, and all the lovely young English girls they met there. After months of silence and uncertainty, the long-awaited day finally arrived. Jim and Aiden returned, their faces marked by the trials of war, but also by the secrets they carried. Hannah, filled with a mixture of relief and apprehension, knew that the moment of truth was upon them. It was time to confront the deception and reveal the hidden truths that had shaped their fates. Although Jim never reveled in the sadness he saw envelop his friend, and it pained him that he was the cause of it, he did rejoice in the hope that Hannah's letters to him seemed to hint of their future together. It was during a skirmish with the Germans just outside a little village in France that Jim was wounded. He took a shell in the shoulder, just serious enough to keep him from returning to fight. After a brief stint in the hospital where the doctors declared him unfit for duty, he was shipped back home. Hannah became an attentive nurse and Jim's shoulder quickly healed. He would never have the range of motion that he'd had before, but many young men from the mountains that had gone off to war and suffered a great deal worse. Hannah was thankful that Jim was alive and now home. Jim was barely up and about before he asked Hannah to marry him. She accepted and they were married the first day in June, in the little church they'd all attended since they were born. The only thing missing was Aiden. Many attending the ceremony that day expressed that regret. The newlyweds soon settled into their new home, a two-roomed log cabin deep in the woods a little farther up the mountain from the holler where Jim had been raised. Jim built the cabin himself from lumber he'd sawyered up himself at the mill where he'd started to work. Their closest neighbors were Seth McPherson and his son, Colin. They were the new owners of the local sawmill and had helped Jim build the little cabin for his new wife. The mill had been shut down for the last 3 days while one of the worst snowstorms of the decade hung tight over the Ozarks. It had been snowing steady for 3 days and nights, but this morning the snow had ceased, and the sun, as it peeped over the treetops, seemed to promise brighter days ahead. It had become Jim's habit to get up first and stoke the fire in the wood cookstove that also served to heat the little cabin, then to put a pot of water on the stove for morning coffee. This morning he did just that, allowing Hannah to snuggle beneath the covers for a few extra winks before she would arise and prepare their breakfast. Jim had just finished filling the coffee pot when suddenly, there came a loud knock at the door and he went to answer. Who would have come in weather like this, he wondered as he opened the door. Hannah, still in bed, heard him exclaim, Aiden! How did you get here? Followed by a gunshot. Hannah jumped from the bed and rushed to the front room. There lay her husband on the floor, blood oozing from a head wound. The door opened to the snow beyond. With a cry of anguish, she fell to her knees and cradled her dying husband in her arms. Mystery and legacy often go hand in hand, weaving tales that transcend generations. In this story, the legacy left behind is deeply intertwined with the mysteries that surround it. Each clue, each revelation, brings us closer to understanding the true essence of what was left behind. With clear weather on the horizon, Mr. McPherson and his son Colin had decided to open the mill. They'd gotten up at dawn, hitched up the mule team, and were on the road to the mill. They planned to stop by and pick up Jim on the way, and had just turned into their lane. Colin was driving the mules slowly through the pristine blanket of knee-deep snow when they heard the shot ring out. As they neared the cabin, they could see the cabin door open and Hannah sitting just inside on the floor. She held Jim's lifeless body in her arms as she rocked back and forth, sobbing loudly. Mr. McPherson stayed with Hannah while Colin took the mules and wagon to fetch the sheriff. Colin had no sooner reached the road when he met the sheriff on horseback coming down the mountain. When they arrived back at the cabin, Hannah had composed herself enough to be able to tell the sheriff what had happened. Hannah recounted the events to the sheriff. Hannah, I was still in bed just waking up. I could hear Jim stoking the fire in the stove, could hear him put the coffee pot on, then heard a knock on the door. A loud knock. Then I heard Jim open the door and shout out kinda surprised like, Aiden? And then I heard the shot. The sheriff then shared some troubling news. Sheriff Hannah, I was just on my way down the mountain to take a message to Aiden's ma in PA. The telegraph came 2 days ago, but this was the first I was able to get to the road because of the weather. It was from the army, Hannah. Aiden was killed in Normandy 3 days ago. Hannah, with a voice filled with disbelief, asked, Then who was it, Sheriff? Who knocked on the door? Who killed my husband? Sheriff, did Jim have a gun, Hannah? Hannah, yes, his hunting rifle. But it's over at his daddy's. He's putting a new sight on it for him. Sheriff, well, Hannah, we'll figure it all out, don't you worry. Now why don't you get a few things together and let Mr. McPherson take you up to your granny's while we work this out, okay? Mr. McPherson? Sheriff, something you need to know about what we saw when we got here this morning. We heard the shot just as we was coming up the lane to get Jim to go to work. No more than half a minute away. When we pulled up into the yard, there weren't no footprints in the snow. Nothing but pure white snow, like a white sheet laid out there, all around the yard, all around the porch. Not even a bird's or a rabbit's footprint out there. Hannah never went back to the little cabin. The next summer she married Colin McPherson, and they lived with his father for a few years until they were able to buy a farm over in Ozark County. They both lived well into their 80s and are buried on the place in a little grove of cedar trees there on the farm, where they raised their large family of 4 boys and 2 girls. Even today, many of their descendants live in the area, and locals still remember the old story of how a boy killed in war put off his trip to heaven to have his revenge on the one that betrayed